The Culture Pop Podcast is brought to you by the law offices of Jacob and Ronnie.
Accident or injury, call Jacob and Ronnie. Call Jacob.
Hey, it's Mace. If you or a loved one is injured in any kind of accident, please don't wait. Call Jacob immediately for a free consultation. That's right, free. When an accident happens, it can turn your world upside down, so put the best on your side. Jacob doesn't even get paid unless you win. First name, first thought, first call, Jacob. After an accident, 24 hours a day, call 844-24-JACOB or visit calljacob.com.
Call Jacob.
Welcome to the world of Culture Pop with Steve Mason and Sue Kalinsky. Culture, comedy, movies, TV, tech, authors, trends, pop. This is the Culture Pop Podcast.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Culture Pop Podcast, first one of 2020, episode 28. Sue Kalinsky, it is great seeing you.
It is so great seeing you, Steve.
How were the holidays for you?
Long, which was good.
Yeah.
I was off for 2 weeks, but it felt like 4 months.
I had a long break.
I know.
You're
like
nice.
you're Waldo.
It was so nice. Yeah, I was everywhere. It was so nice.
So where'd you go?
Went to Costa Rica. Spent about a week and a half in Costa Rica. Came back. Went to my mom's Christmas out in Palm Springs. Then went on yoga retreat at California Hot Springs. At midnight exactly, we were in dead silent meditation.
Really?
Yes. It was so awesome to be in that spot.
You know, the only time I'm up at midnight is when I have to go pee.
It's so funny. We were the same way. Even everybody at the yoga retreat was like, how are we going to make it to midnight? Damn. But we made it.
That was a nice way to ring in
and
the
it was
new year.
A really cool way to ring in the new year.
I was on the toilet.
Yeah. We'll talk. Congratulations.
I said when I'm up at midnight, I'm peeing.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right. Bunch of movies out right now. It's award season. You get screeners. I get screeners. It's really fun. Our guest right now is the screenwriter and playwright whose new film is Dark Waters. Mario Correa is here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So how did the movie Dark Waters come to you?
So I was a playwright in New York, actually, a few years back, and a guy named Benjamin Blake, who's a manager out here, went to a play of mine and talked to me afterwards and said, you know, I think you can be a feature or TV writer. And I thought he was crazy, and I told him so. But I ended up having him manage me, and eventually came out to LA after I'd written a script called Let Her Speak, which was about Wendy Davis's filibuster in Texas a couple of years ago. Anyway, long story short is Participant Media, the studio behind Dark Waters, had read that script, Let Her Speak, and they liked it, so they brought me in for a meeting. And we just had a really nice meeting. I didn't think much of it at the time other than the fact that I really liked the executives there. And then I get a call sort of out of the blue a few weeks later that Todd Haynes has attached to a project at Participant. And honestly, that is all I remember of the conversation, because I said to Ben on the phone, I said, yes, you know, I don't care what it's about. And I really didn't. I was like, whatever this is about, I'm on it. And then when I got the first draft of the script, it's such a complicated subject. I was like, oh, I should have asked what it was about, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the script is this sprawling story that encompasses 13 years, and it involves the complexities of the legal system and chemistry. I mean, was that daunting for you?
Yeah, it was really daunting, you know, and I should say that that Matt Carnahan wrote the first draft, and Matt's awesome, and he had really taken, you know, the first stab at this before having to go off to direct a movie in Morocco, and so that's when Participant brought me on for the next take on it, and so it was daunting to basically get my arms around the whole thing. It's actually, I think, 17 or 18 years, the time period. And it involves two separate legal cases, so we had to resolve one and then get into the other. And like you said, there's a lot of chemistry in there. And I was a terrible chemistry student in high school. But what saved it for me actually was I sat down with Rob Ballot, Mark Ruffalo, who is, in addition to starring, of course, in the film and being amazing in it, is our producer and is so passionate about it. And Mark and I and Todd went out to Ohio, and I sat with Rob Ballot, who is the subject of our film. And Rob said to me at one point, he goes, I was a terrible chemistry student in high school. And then when I thought, oh my God, this guy has devoted 20 years of his life to this case. If he can do this for 20 years, I can figure out a script in that'll last 2 hours. And that's when I decided to take it on, basically.
So Rob Ballot is the subject, as you mentioned, of the film, and really, it's about DuPont and it's about Teflon and the poisoning that happened in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Right. But it's really more about Rob Ballot than anything. It's a very human story.
That was really important to us because the case is a fascinating case and it's a tragic story about corporations gone awry and the effect that brings on all of us. But the truth is that there's so many of these potential cases of malfeasance, right? And we knew that if the story focused on one case, then that's it. That's the entirety of the story. But if we told a story about a man, or a human person and his family, his wife Sarah and their kids, basically having to live through 20 years of fighting, then it becomes a story about us, right? It becomes a story about the human struggle to persevere, to do what is right, to fight against all those all those forces that were conspiring against him. And that's what we wanted to do. And that's why we focused the story on Rob.
I mentioned 13 years, and now I realize why. I was involved in a massive antitrust lawsuit, my little company against a big, gigantic movie theater chain. And it was a 13-year case. So I've got a feeling for what that's like and how draining it is and what a painful experience it is and how hopeless it sometimes becomes. And I thought your script did a really great job of sort of capturing that feeling.
Thank you. That was really a focus. We needed to basically, we needed to have audiences feel the slog that Rob's life had become without themselves feeling like they were in a slog of a movie, and that was the challenge. We had to really work on how do you extend time, how do you show that passage of time, how do you make that audience feel like they are with him, and that was really the focus that I focused on in that second draft.
And I think television in particular has created this impression that the law happens really fast. Like if you watch an episode of Law and Order, it takes 1 hour to follow through this entire case. What you don't notice is it says like part 57 at the bottom, part 76. Like there's a lot of time that takes place between motions and between decisions and discovery and all that business. And so I think people don't realize the time and the energy and the effort it requires to actually see through an important case.
Yeah, no, that's really true, and that is, I think, the real challenge of telling this story on film, right? Because we had to find ways that we understand that passage of time that are both visual, so we have, Rob and his wife, Sarah Bartlett, have 3 boys, and we see, from the first baby on to at the very end when all the boys have essentially gone through high school. And so there's that, of course, and there's the aging of the actors in the process, but there's also like the tempo. So we had a lot of legal storytelling to get through in the first half of the film. And then we had to slow everything down and just have the audience feel the pain that Rob and his family felt at the sheer slowness of that case, which, by the way, is still ongoing. So he's still living it.
How difficult is it to write a film based on a true story?
It has it has real challenges and has some advantages. True, to be honest. So the advantage of working on a true story is that someone has written the arc of that story for you. God or whoever else. The consequence of events exists, right? So I know where my story starts and I know where my story ends, and then I figure out the arc of what happens in between. And that is not an insignificant thing for a writer to be given, his beginning and his end. It's or her beginning and her end. And the challenge, of course, is how do you write an accurate story that accurately depicts what happens, but is also dramatically interesting and narratively interesting. And this film had an additional challenge, to be honest, which is we talked about the complexity, right? It's about chemistry and law, two things that are, by definition, really tough. And then we're dealing with DuPont Chemical, which is, a humongously powerful and obviously very litigious company. So there could be nothing in this script that was not absolutely accurate, or at least had its basis in fact such that it passed the test of many, many lawyers who read this draft over at Participant Media. The legal vetting on this script is something unlike anything I've seen before.
How involved was Rob during the process?
Oh my gosh, so involved. We first, myself, Todd Haynes, and Mark Ruffalo went out and spent a bunch of time with Rob and his family. Then together with Rob, Todd Haynes and I went out to Parkersburg, West Virginia, and spent time with the families who had been impacted in this case, which was really, it was an incredible thing for us to see. For example, Todd and I went onto the parking lot of the big Washington Works plant, which is at the center of this story. And a security guy comes and spots us and says, "What are you guys doing here?" And kicks us off the lot. And we get a sense of just like how private and how careful they are there. But Rob was so involved that we had I can't tell you how many hundreds of conversations, thousands of emails and text messages, more phone call conversations than I can recall. And with Sarah, his wife too, she was is an amazing person. And in the film, we only get to show a little bit of her struggle just because of the sheer amount of story that we're telling. But speaking with Sarah, tons of times as well.
Were you able to talk to or spend time with people in Parkersburg who were affected by this, for lack of a better term, poisoning?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is a couple that we meet in the film, the Kigers, Joe and Darlene Kiger, and they were the people who were willing to be essentially the leads in this class action case that Rob brings in the film. And, Darlene Kiger, had been married to a chemist at the DuPont plant. And so she had spent, much of her early years and her kids' early years reaping, the benefits of being a DuPont employee. They would she talks in the film, and this is right from our interview with her, about how DuPont would give them gifts for no reason. They'd say, "Hey, here's a catalog of gifts, pick." Or here's a turkey because it's Friday. Here's a ham because it's Monday. They really gifted their employees, and it was part of their way of sort of co-opting this town, and being really the most significant employer in town. So all of a sudden, the entire town is built on this relationship with this company. And here we meet the Kigers, which we did in real life, and sit down with them. By this point in her life, Darlene was remarried to Joe Kiger, and she had a hysterectomy when she was 36 years old. She'd had many friends and neighbors who've gotten serious cancers and passed away. And Darlene knew that something was up, and so did Joe, her husband, who who received a letter from DuPont that from the water district, that supposedly said everything is fine, but Joe knew something wasn't. So here's this couple in the middle of this town who decides to take on this huge corporate behemoth, knowing that they will be ostracized from the community, which they are. And we spent time with them talking about that.
So there's a haunting scene in the movie where the character played by Bill Camp, who I love as an actor. He's such a great actor.
He's so wonderful. So great.
Where he looks out over his field and points out all of the graves of all of his cows that have been poisoned and died. was that based in reality? Was that character a real person?
Oh yeah, an absolutely real person. Bill Camp, who, as you said, is an incredible actor and is wonderful in this film, plays Wilbur Tennant, and Wilbur Tennant is or was a farmer just outside of Parkersburg whose cows were dying inexplicably. He had farmed his family's land for generations. He knew more than anyone how a farm runs, and he lost more than 190 cows inexplicably, and he knew something was wrong, and so he took these videotapes, and we see the videotapes in the movie. Those are actually Wilbur's videotapes of his dead cows, and he would find dead deer and everything that was happening, and he would then open the cows. Literally, he would surgically open. He was not a surgeon. He would open them and look at their gallbladders and look at their teeth and take photos and take videotapes. And he needed a lawyer who would basically sue DuPont, which had a dump up the hill from his place. And the irony, of course, is that the land was sold to DuPont by Wilbur's own brother, who was essentially sort of pushed into selling by DuPont because Wilbur's brother Jim was sick and needed money. And so he had to sell the land to DuPont. Then DuPont used it as a dump, which killed these cows. So Wilbur tries to find a lawyer in town to take this case, and no one would because they're all afraid of DuPont. So he hears that there's a guy in Cincinnati who is the grandson of a woman that he knows tangentially in town, and that guy is an environmental lawyer. And that's when Wilbur sets on this journey to Cincinnati to find that quote-unquote environmental lawyer. He finds Rob Bilott, only to learn that Rob Bilott actually defended chemical companies. That was his job. But Rob sees these videotapes, talks to Wilbur, and realizes something is very wrong. And Rob begins what he thinks is going to be just a simple case of maybe there's something in the water just, right there in his ravine, so that they can just, figure out quickly. And turns out to be a humongous conspiracy that affects not only that land, but 99% of humans, because all of us who have used Teflon are and other waterproof products are somehow affected.
I love how DuPont, the legal department, sent millions of boxes of of all their studies to Bilott. And you would think that they would know what kind of lawyer he was, thinking, oh, it's so much information, he'll just give up. And that just fueled him so much. Yeah,
that, by the way, is a typical strategy when a gigantic company is involved in litigation. They'll just give you too much information to go through, right?
Yeah, they gave him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of legal boxes, humongous boxes, which they knew would take anyone, it would take a team of people years to go through. And they thought there's no way in hell this guy is going to do this. And we show that in the film. We show him opening or the first box collapsing because some of the boxes were so old that, they sent him documents from the 1950s to drown him in documents, So some of these boxes were so old and so full of dirt and stuff that they were, or dust, that they collapsed in his hands. And we show that. And the first box that we see collapse, he pulls out the first thing he finds in this box, and it is a Christmas card from 1957. Now, if I were to see that, I'd be like, you know what? Screw this. There's no way I'm going to go through all these boxes, especially if they throw things like Christmas cards in them. But instead, because Rob is this kind of person, he sits down, he takes out a Post-it note and a pen, and he marks, he puts that Post-it note on the card and says 1957, and that becomes his first pile. And every document of the millions of documents in those boxes will be sorted by Rob over the next several years, just like he did that one.
There's the kind of a strata of movies that I really like, whether it be All the President's Men or Silkwood or The China Syndrome, these kind of whistleblower dramas. Was that a reference point for you and for Todd?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think that this film is really an homage to Pacula and to those films in particular. Todd's a huge fan, and so am I, of All the President's Men, Parallax View. In fact, it's funny. Todd basically put me through Todd Haynes Film School when we connected on this. He said, "Hey, there's a list of films I'd really like for you to see and for us to talk about," which for a writer is such an amazing ask to get. And so So I'm like, please. And he gave me a list of films that he wanted us to talk about, which included, of course, China Syndrome, All the President's Men, Parallax View, Silkwood, many others and through talking about those, I not only, of course, got a great insight into Todd's thinking, but came to this idea as well of Todd's that this film was going to be an homage to a type of film, a genre that was really prevalent in the 70s when our thinking about these issues was evolving, and that hasn't been done a lot lately. Well, we have, of course, like The Insider was an amazing film. I watched that as well, but the height of these films was really in the 70s and early 80s, and we wanted to get back to that.
Todd has got an amazing film biography, and across genres. I mean, Velvet Goldmine and Far From Heaven and Carol and Wonderstruck. What makes him? I'm assuming he's a real cinephile. What makes him special as a director?
Gosh, wow, that's a great and humongous question. I'm going to start with something maybe just sort of personal in that Todd is an incredibly kind and empathetic person. He had no business hiring someone like me to write this script for him. I mean, he is, like you said, an esteemed and accomplished director. I did not have a screenwriting credit to my name. He just read a script of mine that he liked, and he took this gamble on me, which gives you a sense of the kind of person he is, because he's not about sort of, where you're from or who you are, but rather what does he think that you have inside you. And when we sat down, he was so empathetic about the struggle of these people, and that is, I think, something that runs through all of Todd's films. So whether it's Velvet Goldmine or whether it's this or Wonderstruck or all of these different types of movies that Todd does, in each one we are so empathetic with a character. We feel their struggle because Todd feels their struggle. And so, we can talk for hours, of course, about Todd's visual language and his incredible ability to sort of grasp the history of cinema and include these references. But really, I think it boils down to something much simpler, which is that he is such an empathetic human being that each of his films reflect that. And I think Dark Waters is very much in line with the Todd Haynes films for that reason.
I want to go back to something earlier that you said in the beginning of the interview, that when you were asked to write this, that the fact that you had never written a screenplay, but you were a playwright, and you were like, oh God, how am I going to do this? What is the biggest difference? I mean, you're a writer, so what is the biggest difference between the two?
Sure. I had written one screenplay, which is the one that Todd had read and basically hired me on. But the biggest difference, and this is, I'll give you a Todd story, which I personally sort of love, is that in playwriting, really, language is the only thing you really have to tell the story. Sets are very simple. There's not a lot of movement or choreography in a traditional, what we call a straight play. And of course, film being a visual medium opens up all these other kinds of possibilities. And I had to get out of my head and think about the things that we were going to show the audience, right? Without the use of language being the underpinning. And Todd, to me, said something which really blew my mind, which is the most basic, and it's embarrassing to share with you, but I will. He said to me at one point as I wrote, and because I would share the script sequentially with him, I shared the first act, the second act, etc. He was so supportive, thankfully, and liked what was happening. But he said to me at one point, he said, in some scenes, no one has to say anything at all. And it blew my mind. It really blew my mind. It had not occurred to me, I'm embarrassed to say, that there would be scenes in which we would only see our characters struggling, and that's what I went back and did, and took out a bunch of things. To the point that I was taking out more than I think Todd even wanted at some point, because I was like, no, I don't think we need to even hear any words. I think we just need to see this. And we it's a cliche to say, oh, he was so collaborative, but he was so collaborative. I cannot stress enough what it was like to sort of be hand in hand with Todd Haynes on this, and it's a real gift.
Mark Ruffalo has said about Dark Waters, sometimes a movie lands in the world at the right moment. He was really passionate about this project. What is it about this moment that makes this the right film?
I think with everything going on in the world today, there's a certain sense of helplessness, right? And we watch all these events happening around us, and it's tempting to sort of bury our heads in the sand. And what Mark saw in Rob's struggle, which I think is really an incredibly insightful thing, and because Mark is so insightful, is that no matter the issue, whether it's environmental justice or any of the other sort of issues that affect the country and the world right now, it really does require every person to figure out, okay, what is my part in this? How am I going to make things better, even in my small way? And Mark realized that we needed to see a story where, despite this humongous, overwhelming power, in this case of DuPont, one guy really did make a difference. But at the same time, Mark wanted that story to stress it's not done. There's always going to be a struggle, and we always have to be fighting. We have to fight the system. And that, I think, is the message that Mark saw very much in this film and in the world that's around us, really.
You used the term in something you wrote for the LA Times, system failure, which I think, you were sort of leading to right there, this idea that, there's lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, that there's this level of just overall failure that has pervaded a lot of industries and a lot of situations like this.
Yes, absolutely. And we become, there's two things. I think one is we become sort of numb to hearing these stories. And if we ourselves don't live in Flint, it's tempting to be like, oh, well, someone else is going to take care of that, right? The government of Michigan is going to take care of that, or whichever. And that's something we really wanted to stress in this movie, too. I mentioned in that article in the Times, I used to be a congressional staffer. That's how I sort of started my work life as a Hill staffer to a member of Congress who I really respected, named Connie Morella. And then I was a lobbyist. I did sort of that D.C. thing where you become a lobbyist, which I did not like doing at all. And so I knew the kinds of pressures placed on government by interests, outside interests, corporate interests, and I knew how government just kind of folds all the time. So this idea that we, the citizens, are going to be protected by the laws or by our government, we accept at face value, and it's just not the case. And Mark wanted this film to really stress that it's up to us to defend ourselves. As he says in the film, the system will not protect us. We protect us.
It's funny, just before we did this interview, we were sitting here talking about the homeless crisis here in Los Angeles. And, there's this idea, I wouldn't even know where to start. I wouldn't even know I don't even have a good idea about how to solve it or how to take a step in that direction. There's this hopelessness, this helplessness that exists with big issues right now. And I think the movie gets at that a little bit.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's a great question you pose, which is, how do you take that first step? What is that first step? And we can all be activists no matter our politics. It's not about being right or left or whatever. Rob Bilott, I think, was a very traditionally conservative lawyer type who decided that he could take the first step by helping one farmer. And it just opened up this entire world that he realized needed to be changed. And I think each of us figuring out what that first step is for us personally is the question we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Long Island, New York, and in the 60s, I lived across the street from a canal, and when we were kids, we used to swim in that canal.
Oh, wow.
And we would wear white T-shirts to shield ourselves from getting sunburned. And when we came out of the water, the T-shirts were rust color. And I remember as a kid, coming home, and I don't remember my parents ever saying ooh, what's that from? And nobody really talked about it, but we all swam in the water. Nobody said anything. And then years later, on some magazine show, and I don't remember whether it was 2020 or whatever, a lot of people in my neighborhood, a lot of women got breast cancer, and there was this surge of cancer in my town. And I know it was from what was ever in that water, because we all swam in it, we all boated in it, and people probably even fished and ate fish from that water. So, the awareness wasn't really around back then.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible and dispiriting story. But when we hear so much of them, because it doesn't make us dumb to expect our government to be taking care of us, and so stories like this one, I think, point out that, as we point out in the movie, the EPA, when it started in 1974, banned only about 5 chemicals, and how it decided to ban chemicals was it asked the companies, "Are your chemicals safe?" And unless the company said to them, "Hey, we have a chemical that's not safe," then EPA grandfathered that chemical into regulatory okayness, whatever that term is, approval.
Right.
Approval. And so, so we as I think just citizens, we imagine, oh my gosh, there's probably tens of thousands of chemicals that are banned. Actually, I think it's about 6 or so right now. And that's how DuPont got around this. And that's how all these companies, probably the one that was polluting the canal that you were talking about. So yeah, it's shocking how this is all around us.
Well, you look at what just recently came out with the Delta Airlines flight attendants. They allege that their uniforms were causing skin rashes and headaches and fatigue. And there's a big class action lawsuit being filed with Land's End, who produced the products. And I think to myself, how do they make clothing with any type of materials that could be hazardous to people's health? I mean, it's mind-blowing to me how it continues.
And it does continue because, the FDA doesn't look at clothing. So, for example, and the same the same basic chemical compound used to make Teflon, which is at the heart of our film, is used to make waterproof boots, and it's used to make popcorn bags so the popcorn doesn't stick, and pizza boxes so that the pizza doesn't stick, and the little boxes you get where you put your burgers in at fast food restaurants, all kinds of things, and then your clothes, your waterproof bags, your raincoats. So it's all around us, and that's why 99% of us are somehow in our blood. We have this chemical called C8. This stuff is everywhere. It's not regulated, and as you were saying, whether it's in clothes or in other items, we have to realize that it's up to us to figure out how to keep ourselves safe.
Well, listen, we appreciate you spending some time. The movie is called Dark Waters. Highly recommend it. It's an incredible story. And as you mentioned, Rob Bilott is still, this case is continuing to unfold for people right now.
Absolutely. He is filing, and he filed a case which all of us are class action members. Any of us who have lived in the United States, because we've been impacted by these chemicals, are now in the class that Rob is suing on behalf of, to get companies like DuPont and 3M and others to essentially care for those of us who have been impacted by their chemical pollution.
Well, thank you very much, man. We appreciate this very much. It's a great film. Congratulations.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate you having me on, and I really appreciate your support of the movie. It's the kind of film that needs word of mouth to get out, because it's these issue films. Hopefully, you need to get seen.
All right. Thanks, Mario.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Take care now.
All right, yeah. It's funny. We were talking about the homeless crisis and what can you actually do about it in this sort of, It is. There's like a helpless feeling, a hopeless feeling. And the point of the movie is if you can take just one step. Just if everybody takes one step, does one small thing, maybe there's a way to affect positive change.
Right. But when I think about the homeless, I mean, if we're talking about that just specifically, I don't even know what that one step is.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't know. And I don't know if we ever talked about this, but there was a couple that lived in Northern California that took in a homeless guy.
Right.
And he was African American. And people in the neighborhood saw him walking around and called the police. And they were like, what are you doing here? Because it was an affluent neighborhood.
Right.
And he said, I live with this couple. And they complained. And it's like they were doing something really, really lovely and trying to help him out. And people complained about it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it's got so many other levels to it.
No, it's the old NIMBY thing, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
So people feel like that. Well, it's a great film. It's called Dark Waters. It's in theaters now. We mentioned Bill Camp, who's fantastic in the movie.
Love him.
Mara Winningham is in the movie. Anne Hathaway, and of course Mark Ruffalo. Tim Robbins. Tim Robbins is in it also.
And Victor Garber was great too.
Yeah, great film. So strongly recommended. Thanks very much for listening to the Culture Pop podcast. Remember what do we say? Subscribe, rate, and review. Subscribe, rate, and review. We appreciate that a lot, and we will see you next week.
Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. We'll see you next week for an all-new episode of Culture Pop.